So housing has become one of the biggest issues in Ireland over the last several years. Homelessness numbers continue to rise and many people can't find suitable accommodation. House prices in the rental market and to buy continue to escalate. And this appears, for all the world, to be a problem that we can't fix. So I'm delighted to be joined today by two guests who might shed some light on this. Orla Hegarty is an architect who works at the UCD School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy in UCD. She's a frequent contributor in the public debate on issues related to housing. And Dr. Michael Byrne is a lecturer in political economy at the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice in UCD. And his work has examined many aspects of urban political economy. So I'd like to welcome you both to the show.
Thanks, Paul.
So just to open things out, has this always been a problem? Has the housing market always functioned this way?
I think it's become normalised in the last couple of years to the point where people think it's always been a problem and that it can't be fixed. And forgetting that within a generation we had a fairly stable system in that a lot of people were able to afford to buy in their 20s if they wanted to. People who were on lower incomes could normally access social housing or council housing as it was called, and there was a relatively small private rental sector. That has changed drastically over the last number of years for a whole series of reasons which are complex and have all had an interplay, but we now find ourselves in a situation where people who expected to have a reasonable standard of living in reasonable housing and to have some control over it, so they had a choice of moving if they got a different job or moving to somewhere better or larger, are in housing distress to some extent. A very large number of people are in unsuitable or housing that's in the wrong place.
And Michael, you've done a bit of work on the political economy of housing systems. What's changed?
I think there's three big processes that have changed over the last 30 years or so. The first is what we call financialisation. So the financial system in Ireland and internationally has been significantly deregulated. And what that means is there's more money in the hands of financial institutions and they're looking for places to invest in. And one of the main places they've sought to do that has been in real estate, including housing. What that means is you tend to get higher asset prices, as economists would say, or house prices for you and me, and you get more volatility. So you get more cycles of high house prices, but then you're going to get crashes as well, which is obviously something we know all about in Ireland. The other big issue is neoliberalism or marketisation. Throughout the 20th century, here in Ireland and internationally, there was huge state involvement in the housing system to complement the housing market. That happened through social housing, it happened through subsidies for home ownership, it happened in all sorts of ways. And since the 1980s here in Ireland, we've gotten rid of those policies, which has meant us solely reliant on the market. And it's also made us much more vulnerable or almost helpless in terms of the volatility of housing market cycles and problems like unaffordability. The third issue then is a long-standing one, is urbanisation. Ireland is unusual in that for most of the 20th century we had limited urbanisation, we had a stagnant or in some cases falling population, whereas now we have population growth, we have urbanisation, and we have a service sector based economy where a lot of jobs tend to be clustered in city centres. So we've got a lot of pressure on land nowadays. We have a financial system that's eager to cash in on that, and we have thrown away all the policy tools that we can use to manage that for better outcomes.
So how does this, particularly, you mentioned urbanisation, and I suppose that also feeds into what's happening currently in Dublin. So what is happening? Why are costs rising? Why is it that rents are going up and why are house prices going up? Is it because there's too much regulation? Is it something to do with planning?
You want?
No, go ahead.
Well, I suppose we're always being told it's planning and regulation. There's no evidence to support that at all. And going back to some of Mick's comments there about a more neoliberal approach, Deregulation is part of that agenda, the more regulation you take out, and the less stable the planning system is, the higher the rewards. So, in fact, a planning system that has been stable, and we do have a system that does that. It sets a development plan for 6 years that is stable. That keeps a cap on land values and land speculation. So obviously moves away from that is leading to a situation where there can be higher risk but also higher rewards. So some of the agenda around planning and NIMBYism and blaming regulation isn't borne out by the evidence. Dublin currently has zoned land for more than 100,000 houses, so residential zoned land or homes, and it has live planning permissions for more than 30,000 houses and apartments in Dublin that are current, that are not built, and that could all start building tomorrow. So there's no evidence that there is a blockage in our planning system or in any of that. And in fact, it's the same planning system we had when we were building 90,000 houses a year in 2006. So you have to question where that is coming from. The other push against regulation, some of it is against energy standards and better building standards. And again, you have to question where that's coming from, given that there are tens of thousands of people living in badly built, particularly apartments, but also houses from the Celtic Tiger years. And that is still playing out. And just this week I was at a meeting with apartment owners who are still dealing with huge bills for defects, a lot of uncertainty, and very weak consumer protections. So the idea that we would further deregulate and lower standards in the face of climate change, to leave people with lower standards in terms of living space, energy standards, higher bills, poorer health outcomes, it's totally unjustified in the current situation. And the technology is there to incorporate all of this at no extra cost and to just build lifetime housing. We are only replacing about 1%. We're only adding about 1% of our housing stock at the moment. So 20,000 a year into a stock of about 2 million houses in the country. Well, if you do the maths, every house is going to have to last for 100 years at the rate we're replacing them. And the short-term solutions of accommodating people in the short term or building low-quality buildings that won't last isn't sustainable, really, on any measure. Because they'll either have to be replaced in 15 or 20 years when the buildings outlive their usefulness, or we're going to have to start using more and more resources in terms of building materials and labour, which is contrary to all the climate change objectives.
So this isn't a solution to affordability, making houses cheaper to build, or...
There is no evidence to support it, and there was no evidence to support the reduction in apartment space standards. There were, I suppose simplistically, some people might think that every square metre you build for an apartment costs the same. In fact, if you shrink the floor area 10%, it doesn't make a huge difference in build cost, because your kitchen, your bathroom, your windows and your doors and your heating and all of the high value components are exactly the same when you shrink the unit. So floor space is quite cheap at the time you're building, and it gives a lot more flexibility for different types of occupancy. You can fit more children in bedrooms. You can have more space. I mean, we all get together at Christmas. If you look at the minimum size apartments that are there now, they don't even facilitate families socialising together beyond the bare minimum of people who live in the unit. They don't accommodate people with any level of disability, who might need equipment, who might need a separate bedroom for a child or a carer. So what we have as minimal standards are suboptimum for the vast majority of us, and then push people into commuting long distance for a third bedroom or for a larger kitchen or for some decent outside space. And it's very counterproductive, really, to start reducing standards in the city. We are just promoting more sprawl, which has been one of our biggest problems.
So if that isn't what's behind affordability issues or how prices going up, what is?
Well, the push on a lot of that has been about land speculation. The more we deregulate the system and the smaller the units, the higher the density, the higher the heights of the buildings, you can make windfall profits very, very quickly on regulatory change. And we've seen the amount of volatility in the land market, the inflated land prices, which are directly consequential to some of these changes, and new things like co-living and build to rent being lower standards. the height caps being lifted in Dublin, all of that has immediately fed into land increases in land values, not into more affordability. And it has caused a lot of volatility. We've had repeated planning applications on sites where there's been what might seem like a minor change in standards, but has meant that you can have 4 more floors or 10 more units. That stalls development. And even a small developer maybe who has planning permission and has a site, has their finance in place for maybe 5 stories of apartments on a small site. The minute the height caps were lifted, that finance was probably withdrawn, with an instruction to go back and see, can you get 6 or 8 or 10 floors on that site. So a lot of these measures that on some simplistic analysis might, on a spreadsheet might add up, in reality actually have been hugely disruptive.
Yeah, I might just add to that if I can.
Sure.
On the point about land values, I think that's really important, because central to the whole question of housing is the way in which housing markets function poorly or they face specific problems. Housing is obviously linked to land, and land is inherently supply constrained, so it's not as easy to increase the supply of land as it is to increase the supply of other goods and services that we buy in the economy. Land markets are also inherently local and immobile, right? So if demand for headphones goes up, the supply of headphones can be increased in Thailand to meet that demand here in Ireland. But if the demand for land in Dublin goes up, the only place where you can get that land from is within Dublin. And what that tends to mean, along with other specific features of land markets, is that increased demand doesn't turn into increased supply as we might hope, but instead turns into increased asset prices, increased land prices. And that introduces all sorts of perverse incentives around speculation. And this is why every country in the world that has a large capital city where the economy is growing and relies solely or mainly on the market to provide housing has these types of affordability challenges. So I think right at the heart of this is something that economists call market failure in the housing market, and I don't think that there's any way of addressing this issue that doesn't recognise that problem.
I mean, in work that we did now, it might have been 2.5 years ago really at this stage, wow. But a paper we did, we couldn't find any data on land values. That hasn't been the case. Of course, there's the perennial kind of case of the Kenny report, which has never been kind of acted on, and that seems directly relevant here. I suppose I'm interested as well. It's kind of recognised, and it's increasingly being recognised in the construction industries, that even the kind of supply of workers to build houses is increasingly becoming constrained, and this might be a long-term effect of the housing crash, which might actually, again, tied into that bigger story of those ups and downs. Why become an apprentice when you know that the construction sector is so fickle?
Well, I suppose there's a few aspects to that. I mean, the first one is that I mentioned earlier about standards. One of the reasons we have poor standards in housing historically is this boom-bust cycle, whereby we either have not enough work, people emigrate, people don't train apprentices, and it kills off the skills that are there. People retire earlier, they move careers, and then we get a boom and lots of people flood in because there's money to be made, under time pressure and often without the skills to know what they're doing. So the boom-bust cycle in housing that we have had here, and in the extreme in the last 10 or 15 years, actually is part of the problem. We need to even that out, and a public house building programme historically was the way of doing that, in that you ramp up the public house building in a downturn and you keep the skills and you keep people moving, keep money in the economy, and then you can taper off a bit when there's a boom cycle and people can afford their own housing, and the workers can kind of drift in and out between public and private investment. We've lost that. We also, in some strange way, I think rebuilding Ireland hasn't really been about building Ireland at all. It's been a measure to restore the property market, and maybe to dial the clock back about 15 years in some way by tweaking the dials and setting the conditions back at 2003 or 2004, without really thinking, do we want to do that? What were the risks in that? We have tens of thousands of people who over-borrowed on the back of that, got into too much debt. We have tens of thousands more who bought defective properties on the back of that boom. And it also misses the point that we had a huge influx of workers from Eastern Europe who came with skills when Eastern Europe opened up around 2003 or so. Ireland was one of the few countries where you could move freely. So they came quite a distance because they couldn't go to the nearer countries. And some of them are still here and have had very successful careers still in the construction industry. But they brought skills with them, and they came in their tens of thousands at the time when the money was pouring in and the banks were looking to lend to produce the 90,000 we had in 2006. Now, that's not going to happen again. People from Eastern Europe have stronger economies at home. They can stay, and they can also go to nearer countries. And all things being equal, people tend to stay closer when they leave rather than go far away. So we don't have that. So we're now coming out of a very, very deep recession in construction where we had huge unemployment, and I don't just mean the trades and the skilled people on site management, the professions, the architects and engineers and surveyors, massive unemployment, really decimated as sectors beyond, I think, what a lot of people understand. I mean, the 60% of architects lost their jobs, so it was extremely damaging, and it has been a very slow recovery. So there's been a lack of investment in technology, lack of investment in skills and training, lack of experience for people just day to day on the ground for that 10 years. And now to try and pull out of that without support. So the Rebuilding Ireland programme has been about restoring the property market to, at some second step, that it might restore the house, fix the housing problem. So if you fix the property market, it will organically fix the construction industry and housing, without any initiatives, without any initiative for construction. So even this far into the housing programme, there haven't been any initiatives on the construction side about innovation, about supporting it, about supporting skills. And if anything, we've had an even more fractured industry, which means that it is very unattractive to people to move here. If people have been working in Australia for 5 years and getting great experience, that's a huge barrier to come back into a very fractured sector where you might get a 6-month contract. And you might find it very hard to get housing in Dublin to meet that, and relocate your family. So there are really serious structural issues there in capacity in the sector that haven't been addressed, to my mind, and that are really key now to the affordability challenge, the quality challenge, and the scaling up. You're just scaling up what we're at.
So you mentioned, Orla, the issue of people coming to work in Ireland and they might not find a place to live here. So that sort of raises the issue of, like, what are the costs of this housing crisis elsewhere beyond the construction sector or across the economy?
I think it's if you think about how people are managing their housing distress, you can start to see that. So maybe people who moved to Dublin to go to college are now commuting long distances or not taking up the place. They're running a car rather than living in Dublin and cycling into college. So that's causing problems with congestion and its implications for climate change and capacity in our transport infrastructure. We have people who are commuting longer distances. You can see that all of the growth in recent housing is very heavily focused again on the commuter belt. So into North Dublin, Meath, Kildare, Wicklow, and that means that people are travelling longer distances. There are more, there's more commuting, and often that impacts disproportionately on women and their take up of employment and education. So you find that people are just finding the stress of commuting an hour more every day, or 2 hours in some cases. The pain of that and the cost of creche for very long hours sometimes, and the being so remote from your childcare arrangements and from just that flexibility of being in your community or close to your community during the day, that often is the burden that women are carrying more. You find that people are dropping out of employment or not taking up opportunities, or so that's presumably having an impact. People are having to pay longer hours for creches, which is again a drain on their pocket, and is probably putting stress on our childcare resources and a lot of the people who are low paid in the childcare sector. So there's a lot of things that if you add in the commute or that is impacting other ways, lack of productivity from all of that. And then you have people who are couch surfing and doubling up in bedrooms with bunk beds. That has an impact on their physical and mental health. You have people who are spending more on housing than on other things they need to spend money on. So it means there isn't money in the local economy for people to spend. They don't have a reserve if they lose their job. A lot of people are trying to save for a deposit. And in some cases what they're saving for the deposit, going back to the land value, they're working very, very hard to save maybe 20,000 for a deposit or more in some cases, and that is maybe half of the land value of the site they're buying. So they're actually saving just to chase the land cost, not the cost of building the house. Building the house is not the big ticket purchase. Mostly what they're paying for is the land.
I think I see the impacts in particular within the rental sector, because as home ownership has become more unaffordable and social housing has become more difficult to access, we've seen the share of households renting has doubled in the last 10 or 15 years. And that's where we see the majority, I think, of the really negative impacts of the chaos in the housing system. Rents have increased by about 70% since 2012. So you've got the unaffordability issue, but on top of that then you have a really big problem with insecurity of tenure. So we don't have a huge amount of data about these types of issues, but we do know that the vast majority of people who are presenting as homeless are people who've been evicted from the private rental sector. We know that at least 50% of all tenancies in the rental sector are less than 3 years. So what that means is you've got a huge amount of people who are dealing with unaffordability, but they're also having to move from property to property. And it's very, very difficult to find a place. The Knight Frank, the property consultants, recently did a survey with tenants, and that found that a third of all tenants, or a third of all people who are looking to rent in the rental market now are doing so because they were forced to leave their last rental property. So, I mean, people are getting frequent evictions, the rents are high and the properties aren't there, and that's a recipe for chaos in people's lives and massive stress. I've recently done a piece of research with Threshold on this issue, and I got a lot of people telling stories of getting a notice of eviction and immediately feeling panic, anxiety, depression, paralysis. If you have kids, you've already moved maybe once or twice in the last year to 3 years. You've maybe moved schools. You've had to get the kids set up in a new bedroom. I mean, the implications of moving several times in a short period for a young family are devastating. And then that impacts on your ability to do well in education. It impacts on your ability to sustain employment. It impacts on your ability to access other services. And that's 1 in 4 households in Dublin. A quarter of all families with 2 children in Ireland are renting, and more than 50% alone parent families. So there's a lot of young families in particular, but also single people going through chaos for in what's looking now like indefinitely. That's a really significant cost.
I think just to talk about the children for a minute, I mean, what people mightn't realise is that of the 10,000 homeless, the largest age group in that is the under 4s. So we have a really significant shift in the type of homelessness we had. Going back historically, it tended to be single older men in a lot of cases. We now have family homelessness, which was never a feature of the system here. And the fact that so many young children are living in really unsuitable situations. And I mean, the Children's Ombudsman has done research on this, on the impact on hubs. And distress in childhood is one of the biggest indicators of people not meeting their potential later, or needing social services later, or not being able to engage in their communities later. So there are huge problems being stored up here. I mean, there's a statistic in the last week or so of the DESH schools, so they're the schools in disadvantaged areas, that in some of them a quarter of the children are in insecure or emergency accommodation. Now that will impact on every child in that class, because small children and that level of distress and uncertainty in their home and their parents' stress, is very damaging, even a year in a child's life. Never mind the children who are in their teens trying to do exams or access education, commuting longer distance, from emergency accommodation and things. So we're storing up all kinds of disadvantage for people. But it's not, the thing with it is, it's not the cheapest way of housing people. These emergency solutions are incredibly expensive, much more expensive than actually housing people in a permanent way. And one of the points I've been making is that we have a lot of vacancy. We have housing vacancy, a significant amount. We had 180,000 in the last census of vacant homes. And 5% of that, just to put in perspective, 5% of that 180,000 was how many new houses were built that year. If we had got 5% of the vacancy back, we would have doubled our new stock. We have a lot of commercial vacancy as well. And one of the things you'll see in with pressure with, I suppose, direct provision being moved out of the cities in recent years because of the private rental market in some cases, is the pressure on rural Ireland and putting people in remote locations without supports. When we have towns that are hollowed out all over the country, and suburbs and regional towns with vacancy on upper floors, where we could very easily tap into some EU funding for energy upgrades and put people in permanent housing. So take people out of direct provision, take people out of homeless hubs, out of domestic violence shelters, and start to give them their own key in a community where they have shops and they have a bus service and they have kids can walk to school and things, rather than putting people in institutional settings in remote locations, which has been the government response.
Yeah, and those accumulating problems, I mean, I'm glad we started first with the kind of social dimension of this. Like, a home is such an important part of someone's life. But even if we zoom out and if we delved into maybe the more kind of vulgar area of even just the economic cost of this, the government is currently kind of chasing the private rental sector in terms of demand-side subsidies. I think it's approaching or expected to exceed €1 billion this year in terms of support for placing people in private rental. And there's a big question as to what could you do with that money? Like, could you get so much more value for money using that billion to actually build for the local authorities to get back into that space? Is this, if we're going to style ourselves as making decisions on the basis of being economically rational, is this economically rational? I suppose we might conclude now. We've talked a bit about some of the problems in the Irish system. Is this solvable?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much solvable, but it is a huge problem, and it's a structural problem, and it's a long-term problem. The biggest issue with the approach of the last two governments has been not acknowledging the problem for a period, then recognising the problem, underestimating it, and responding with insufficient levels of decisiveness. So that's been, in my view, that's been the kind of pattern. So if you look at the private rental sector, rent started to go crazy 2014, 2015. First of all, they denied the problem because supply was going to fix the problem, so government don't have to do anything. Then eventually they say, okay, we do have to do something, and they bring in the rent pressure zones with the 4% rent caps, but 4% per annum is too much, and there's no enforcement with it, so many landlords don't comply. So it's too late and not enough is the approach. Same thing with social housing. First of all, it was, we don't need to build social housing, we'll just subsidise the private rental sector. Eventually, 3 years too late, they say, okay, actually, maybe we do need to get back to building some social housing, but they don't put enough capital funding in there really to make it happen on the scale it needs to happen. So the first thing I think is to recognise, when you've got a major problem which is having a devastating impact on your society, you need decisive response. And within that response, then you've got two parts. I would say, first of all, you say the housing system is banjaxed, so that's hurting people. So how do you stop that hurt as soon as possible? And that's where you bring in protections for tenants. So we need real security of tenure for tenants, as in you can't end landlords cannot end a tenancy. You need greater affordability, which you can do through tightening up the 4% rent caps. You can do it through some tax relief for tenants. There's different possibilities there, but one way or another you need to help out on the affordability side. And then you need enforcement. So you need to create a situation where landlords actually comply with the legislation, which is not what happens currently. If you can do those three things, which I think could be achieved in a very short period of time, at very little cost, if any, to the government, you can stop a lot of the pain that people are feeling right now. But you still have to deal with the supply problem, and that's where over the medium and long term, essentially you need a non-market supply of housing that can balance and complement the ups and downs of the market. And with those two things together, I think within a reasonable period, I think we can get back to a functional housing system.
Are there any international examples that maybe we can, well, of course we can't simply lift a template from a different context, but maybe we could take some key ideas. Would there be anywhere you'd look that might offer us some kind of suggestions on that front?
Well, firstly, I'd say I think it's entirely solvable. It needs to be seen as a project. It needs to have a defined success. And it, we're this far in. I don't think anybody has put words on what they see success as. Like, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve 70% home ownership? Are we trying to achieve, what would it look like? I think it would be really useful if we could define what success is and start to put a shape on that and start to measure it. We know what people earn. We know what numbers are in each earning bracket in Dublin. We know we can make some assessment of demographics, although I think in an Irish context with the inward and outward migration, it's always harder to make comparisons. But if we started to define success, we could start to match outcomes to and prioritise things, and that hasn't happened. So we have seen niche sectors chasing the high value earners. If you can pay $3,000 a month in Dublin, you'll have no problem finding accommodation, and yet we're still providing accommodation or prioritising it for people who have more money to spend and will win. I think we need to get smart about the money that's being used. A huge amount of money has been put into the housing sector, but not in a productive way. It's keeping the system on life support rather than actually a treatment plan for the patient. So I think it is, as Mick says, there's a few aspects to it. If you took the churn out of the rental sector, that's leading to a lot of vacancy. Actually, if you add up the numbers, if every change in tenancy is vacant for 3 or 4 weeks, that's adding to the problem because it's not available. So there are things to be done on the rental sector side, obviously, in terms of just physically having more places for people to live and making the limited amount of money available go further. I think vacancy and a set of measures for quality and tax supports or rates or whatever in that, a package could be designed that would be very attractive for people who've got empty spaces. And we could start to take the very high money that's been spent. I mean, they may, in cases, families are, $3,000 a month has been paid for families to be in a very, very unsuitable hotel room when they could be in a rental for a third of that. So let's free up some of the money. And on the capital side, then I think we need to again be careful about how the money is spent. Looking at the O'Devany deal and the cost of that, it's clearly a very poor deal by any measure, and it looks like it's the model for the LDA and for, say, Namalands and Poolbeg. It seems to be the model of how you would go about procurement. Now, in terms of efficient procurement and value for money, it's a very poor approach. And the money won't go very far if we pursue very poor approaches where we might be paying double just for the system that's being the vehicle of delivering it. We have a lot of land compared to other cities that are in housing distress. We're very lucky on that measure. We do have land, so it's a case, and a lot of it is in public ownership and control out of historic reasons with NAMA and with institutions of the state. And we can build in Dublin. We know what it costs to build, and it can be built at affordable levels. I mean, we can see what O'Coolan Cooperative are doing out in Poppentry. They are delivering houses that people can afford, and they will be delivering apartments this year for about 250 or 260,000, completely covering costs, privately financed. So the models are there. Dublin City Council and the other local authorities are able to achieve very good prices on tendering in the market. So not getting a developer on a high risk putting the deal together, but actually paying people monthly to build to a contract. Designing the communities really well. And we have some really good examples. Limerick have been doing good work. Dunleary, Dublin City Council's regeneration in Dolphin House. We have some super examples of design-led new communities that could be great examples for other places. So if we tap into the strengths, the strengths of people in the construction industry who know how to get things done, the kind of contracts managers who go out there and build multi-million euro buildings in 6 or 12 months. These guys have a lot of skill on logistics and procurement. We need the design end, we need the planners and architects to be at the fore of how we go about these communities, and not the economists on a spreadsheet. With respect to the economists, we really need them as well, but not to design our housing communities. And we need to tackle some of the other myths and narratives that are out there at the moment. A lot of the issues people have with new housing in their communities is not the new housing. It's the fact that they are already living with services and infrastructure that is spread very, very thin. And if you can't get a seat on a train from Kildare or Balbriggan, and your kids can't get into Scouts or the GAA team, and they're in a prefab at school, of course you're going to legitimately object to housing locally. You cannot just put housing into a situation without it being a housing community approach. You have to look at what the other needs are. And we are displacing people actively who have those kind of communities in the city, in O'Devney and in Rialto and in Oliver Bond and lots of other communities that are in the city and well established are actually being displaced out, meaning that we have capacity in city schools now where people have been displaced, say in Dublin 8, for student housing and other hotel uses and things. So you end up with spare capacity in places where people could cycle to work and the schools could fit them, being put out further by some of these approaches into areas where they don't have school capacity, and the roads and the rail services are oversubscribed. So we really need to start thinking rationally about this. If the long-term plan of Ireland 2040 is to have sustainable communities in our cities, that means family accommodation that's affordable in nice places, so that people don't see moving to Naas or Swords or somewhere as being the only viable alternative to raise a family, that they have an option that is better or affordable and equal. And we haven't really tackled that at all yet. In fact, a lot of the policies are just pushing for people further out.
Yeah, so it as much about sort of building as making it a nice place to live, making a community livable in the long term, and that's should be a key part of sustainability.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, sure.
I think that is that's a really important point, and the cities that get this right are mainly, if you look at countries that have the high density, so big populations, not a lot of land, and they urbanised early, these are usually the countries that kind of got this issue right because they had to figure this out a long time ago. And Netherlands being the chief one, which is one of the most highly densely populated and most urbanised countries in the world. It's practically a giant city, one giant city, the Netherlands. So they realised that this, that much pressure on a small amount of land, the housing markets are going to go haywire. And so they were going to have to take a chunk of their cities and take it right out of the market and do things in a different way that was compatible with those with the nature of the society they had. And they do that through having very high volumes of social housing. So Amsterdam, as much as 60% of all housing is social housing or non-market housing. And they think about social housing in a very different way. So they think about social housing as a way of ensuring that you have a steady supply of relatively affordable housing, and that also gives you control of how your city develops. It allows you to ensure your city develops in a nice way, in a way that's integrated with transport, and particularly at the moment in a way that can respond to the challenges around climate change and environmental sustainability. In this country, we've tended to see social housing as a charity for the small minority of people who can't afford to buy a home. Historically, that has been the kind of approach. And we need to move away from that idea that social housing is real low rent and it's just for a small minority of people on very low incomes, and think about social housing more as a tool that allows us to create the type of city that we want to create. That can be done in a way that is financially very sustainable for the state, and it allows you to ensure that a huge issue at the corner of your, or at the core of your society and your economy is dealt with in the long term.
And we have, I mean, just to add to that, we have had mass public housing building programs in the past that have been very successful.
Yeah.
And you know, if you look properly at the research of how those communities have fared over time, other factors aside, where we've had maybe areas with out services or at times of mass unemployment or other challenges, they have been very successful communities. And I think we need to challenge that notion that these estates haven't worked and have been a problem. They have worked, and often when there has been difficulties and failures, it's been for other reasons, not to do with the residents who live there or the tenure arrangements they have with how they pay for their home. So, you know, I would support that view that Europe has a longer history of urbanisation, and I suppose urbanisation before people had cars. You know, America and Australia have their history later, when people did, and suburbia was seen as the ideal. And it is notable that in all the debate about high-rise and things in Dublin, people are using American examples and not European examples because they won't find them. And that often what they are showing as images are high-rise city centres without showing the massive sprawling suburbs that surround that, where most people live. And you know, even if you look at somewhere like Sydney, which they might hold up as being a very pleasant city centre with high-rise and somewhere to live, about 0.3% of the population of Sydney live in that city centre, because tall buildings are very expensive and you need to have a high rent return. So it's either very prestigious office building or a high-end hotel or high-end penthouses that will give the return to pay for that investment. Mass housing doesn't add up at high rise, and it's not suitable for families. And the higher you go, the more inefficient the building becomes. It's more expensive to build, it's more expensive to maintain and run, and it's not suitable for every use. So what we have seen in the debate about high rise is really about maximising sites and density on sites. And that's back to the conversation about land values. It hasn't been about densifying Dublin sustainably. We could very easily densify Dublin at 5 or 6 floors, well beyond what we need, and it would be a much more pleasant place to live.
So you heard it here, folks. There are solutions to the crisis, and this isn't something that can't be solved. So thanks again to my guests, and thanks for watching. Now, you can subscribe to the NERI YouTube channel, and you'll get notifications for future videos. This won't be the last of them. Follow us on Twitter. You'll see a regular list of our events, different releases, etc.